The ancient world had never seen anything like Assyria. By the 7th century BC, its armies had crushed every rival between the mountains of Iran and the shores of the Mediterranean. Its kings ruled from palaces sheathed in carved stone, corridors lined with images of conquered peoples bearing tribute and enemies dying beneath Assyrian blades. Its capital at Nineveh sprawled across the Tigris floodplain, a city of perhaps 100,000 souls, the largest the world had yet produced. And into this empire, at the height of its terrible glory, sometime around 685 BC, a prince was born who would become both its greatest scholar and its last great king. His name was Ashurbanipal. The god Ashur is creator of the air, and from his first breath, he was surrounded by power, violence, and ancient knowledge in measures that would shape everything he became. The dynasty he entered had clawed its way to supremacy through blood. His grandfather, Sennacherib, had built Nineveh into a wonder of the age, constructing the palace without rival with its 71 rooms and countless reliefs celebrating Assyrian might. But Sennacherib's reign ended in 681 BC with a crime that haunted the family for generations. The king was murdered by his own sons, cut down in a temple while praying to the gods he claimed to serve. The assassins fled, and the throne passed not to them, but to a younger prince who had remained loyal, Ashurbanipal's father, Esarhaddon. Esarhaddon never forgot how he had gained his crown, nor how easily it might be lost. He was a capable ruler, aggressive in war and shrewd in administration, but anxiety gnawed at him. Omens obsessed him. He consulted diviners before every decision, searching the entrails of sacrificed animals and the movements of stars for signs of divine favor or impending disaster. The murder of his father had taught him that danger could come from within the royal house as easily as from foreign enemies. This fearful, driven man raised Ashurbanipal in the shadow of those lessons. The prince grew up within the walls of Nineveh, where every surface proclaimed the ideology of Assyrian kingship. Stone reliefs depicted the king as hunter, warrior, and priest, the living representative of the god Ashur on earth, charged with imposing divine order on a chaotic world. Gardens and orchards softened the harshness of sun-baked brick, while canals brought water from distant mountains to sustain a city that had no business existing in such an arid landscape. Temples rose at every corner, their priests performing the endless rituals that maintained cosmic balance and kept the gods favorably disposed toward Assyria's ambitions. But Ashurbanipal received something almost no other prince in the ancient Near East was given: an education fit for a scholar. Most royal sons learned to fight, to hunt, to command armies, and intimidate rivals with displays of physical prowess. Ashurbanipal learned these things too. He would later boast of his skill with bow and spear, his courage in the lion hunt. Yet alongside martial training, he received systematic instruction in the scribal arts: reading, writing, mathematics, astronomy, and divination. He studied the ancient languages of Akkadian and Sumerian, mastering scripts that had been old when his ancestors were still nomads on the steppe. He read omen literature, hymns to the gods, royal correspondence stretching back centuries, and the great myths that explained how the world came to be. This was extraordinary. Literacy in the ancient world was a specialized skill. The province of scribes who spent years mastering the hundreds of cuneiform signs required to read and write. Kings typically had scribes read to them and take their dictation. They did not dirty their hands with stylus and clay themselves. For a crown prince to achieve genuine fluency was almost unheard of. Ashurbanipal would later boast of his accomplishments in inscriptions that still survive. I learned the craft of the sage Adapa, the hidden treasure of all scribal knowledge. I can read tablets in obscure Sumerian and Akkadian, which are difficult to interpret. I have examined inscriptions on stone from before the flood. Whether that last claim was literally true, inscriptions from before the mythical deluge, mattered less than what it revealed about his self-image. Ashurbanipal saw himself as heir, not merely to a throne, but to the accumulated wisdom of all Mesopotamian civilization. Knowledge, in his mind, was as essential to kingship as military strength. His mother reinforced this unusual upbringing. Nakia, also called Zakutu, wielded influence that few queens in the ancient world could match. She had been a palace woman of obscure origins, possibly foreign-born, who rose through Sennacherib's favor to become mother of his chosen successor. After Sennacherib's assassination, she had helped secure Esarhaddon's grip on power, and her influence persisted throughout his reign. Court intrigues swirled around her, and her voice carried weight in councils where decisions of war and peace were made. Nakia understood that succession was the most dangerous moment for any dynasty. Sennacherib had been murdered by princes who felt cheated of the throne. The same fate could await Esarhaddon or his sons if the transition of power was not managed with extreme care. She worked alongside Esarhaddon to ensure that when the time came, Ashurbanipal's path to the throne would be cleared of obstacles. There was a complication. Ashurbanipal had a brother. Shamash-Shumukin was likely older, and by normal rules of succession might have expected to inherit the empire. But Esarhaddon devised a solution that he believed would prevent the fratricidal violence that had torn apart previous generations. He would divide authority between his sons. Ashurbanipal would become king of Assyria, ruling the empire from Nineveh. Shamash-Shumukin would become king of Babylon, governing that ancient and sacred city as a subordinate but still royal figure. Each brother would have a crown. Neither would need to destroy the other. In 672 BC, Esarhaddon formalized this arrangement through an extraordinary measure. He summoned vassal kings, governors, and officials from across the empire and compelled them to swear binding oaths, the succession treaty, promising to support both princes in their assigned roles. The gods themselves were invoked as witnesses, and horrific curses were pronounced against anyone who violated the agreement. If you break this oath, the treaty warned, may your cities be destroyed, your families slaughtered, your names erased from memory forever. The young Ashurbanipal watched as the great men of the empire knelt and swore to uphold his future reign. He was perhaps 13 years old. Somewhere in his mind, he must have understood what the elaborate ceremony implied. That oaths were necessary because loyalty could not be assumed. That power rested ultimately on fear, and that even the most sacred promises might be broken when advantage demanded it. The years that followed tested both his education and his patience. Esarhaddon campaigned relentlessly, extending Assyrian power into Egypt and crushing rebellions that flared across the empire's vast expanse. Ashurbanipal remained in Nineveh, continuing his studies, observing the flow of intelligence reports and administrative correspondence that kept the empire functioning. He learned how information moved through networks of scribes and messengers, how governors reported to the center, how decisions made in the palace rippled outward to affect millions of subjects who would never see the king's face. He learned that knowledge was power, not merely in the abstract, but in the daily practice of ruling an empire too large for any one man to see with his own eyes. The king who controlled information controlled everything. In 669 BC, Esarhaddon marched toward Egypt again. The previous campaign had conquered the ancient land, but rebellion had broken out, and the king intended to crush it personally. He never arrived. Somewhere on the long road south, death found Esarhaddon, whether from illness, exhaustion, or some other cause. The sources do not say. He was perhaps in his 50s, worn down by years of warfare and the endless anxiety that had defined his reign. Messengers raced north to Nineveh, carrying news that would change Ashurbanipal's life forever. His father was dead. The oaths had been sworn, the arrangements made, the succession planned with obsessive care. Now came the moment of truth. Ashurbanipal was approximately 20 years old. He had spent his entire life preparing for a throne he had never been certain he would reach. Now the empire awaited, the largest and most powerful the world had ever known, stretching from the Nile to the Persian Gulf, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia. The scholar prince was about to become king. The succession that Esarhaddon had planned with such obsessive care now unfolded with remarkable precision. Nakia moved first. The Queen Mother understood that the hours after a king's death were the most dangerous, when ambitious men might see opportunity in chaos. Before rivals could organize, before whispers could become conspiracies, she summoned the nobles and officials of Nineveh and compelled them to swear a new oath, a personal loyalty pledge to her grandsons that reinforced the succession treaty of 672 BC. Anyone who had harbored thoughts of challenging the arrangement found themselves bound by sacred promises before they could act. Within weeks of Esarhaddon's death, Ashurbanipal stood in the great temple of Ashur and received the crown of the Assyrian Empire. The coronation rituals were ancient, stretching back centuries to when Assyria had been merely one city-state among many in the fractured landscape of Mesopotamia. Priests anointed him with sacred oils. He grasped the hands of the god Ashur's statue, symbolically receiving divine authority to rule. Hymns proclaimed him the chosen instrument of heaven, the shepherd appointed to guide his people, the warrior destined to crush the enemies of order. The ideology was explicit. Ashurbanipal ruled not by accident of birth alone, but by the will of the gods themselves. At the same time, hundreds of miles to the south, his brother Shamash-Shumukin underwent parallel ceremonies in Babylon. The ancient city, older than Assyria, revered throughout Mesopotamia as a center of learning and religion, received its own king, subordinate to Nineveh, but royal nonetheless. The arrangement Esarhaddon had designed was now reality. 2 brothers, 2 thrones, 1 empire. For the moment, it worked. Ashurbanipal's first challenge was not rebellion, but consolidation. The empire his father left him was staggeringly vast, over 1,000 miles from its Egyptian territories to its eastern frontiers, encompassing dozens of peoples who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and submitted to Assyrian rule only because the alternative was annihilation. Governors administered distant provinces with considerable autonomy. Vassal kings paid tribute and provided troops, but nursed grievances that might flare into revolt at any sign of weakness. Client states along the borders watched for opportunities to reclaim their independence. Holding this patchwork together required constant attention, and Ashurbanipal brought to the task skills that no previous Assyrian king had possessed in equal measure. He could read. This simple fact transformed how he governed. Previous kings had relied on scribes to summarize reports, to read correspondence aloud, to filter the vast flow of information that poured into Nineveh from every corner of the empire. Ashurbanipal could examine the original documents himself. He could compare reports from different sources, catch inconsistencies, detect when governors were shading the truth or concealing problems. The intelligence networks his predecessors had built became far more powerful in the hands of a king who could process their output directly. Letters flowed into Nineveh by the thousands, from military commanders reporting on frontier conditions, from priests describing omens observed in distant temples, from spies embedded in foreign courts, from officials requesting guidance on matters great and small. Ashurbanipal read them, annotated them, filed them for future reference. His palace became an archive as much as a residence, its rooms filling with the clay tablets that recorded every aspect of imperial administration. He governed through writing as much as through decree. His responses went out bearing the royal seal, instructions that carried the weight of divine-backed authority to officials who might never see the king in person. The empire was too large for any ruler to visit more than a fraction of its territories in a lifetime. Ashurbanipal compensated by extending his presence through text, making his will known in places his body could never reach. The arrangement with Babylon required particular delicacy. Shamash-Shumukin was king, but he was not equal. Ashurbanipal held supreme authority over the empire as a whole, including theoretical supremacy over his brother's domain. The relationship demanded careful management, enough autonomy to satisfy Babylonian pride, enough oversight to ensure that Babylon remained subordinate to Nineveh. For now, the brothers maintained cordial relations. Shamash-Shumukin sent appropriate tribute, acknowledged Ashurbanipal's seniority, and governed his ancient city without provoking conflict. But the tensions inherent in the arrangement were obvious to anyone who understood human nature. Shamash-Shumukin ruled one of the most prestigious cities in the known world, yet he remained forever second to a younger brother. Babylonian courtiers whispered that their king deserved better, that the great city should not bow to upstart Nineveh. The resentments that would eventually tear the empire apart were already germinating, invisible but present. For now, Ashurbanipal focused on more immediate problems. Egypt, the prize his father had died trying to secure, remained restive. The Nubian pharaoh Taharqa, driven from Memphis by Esarhaddon's armies, had not accepted defeat. He lurked in Upper Egypt, waiting for the opportunity to reclaim his throne, encouraging local rulers to resist Assyrian authority. The situation demanded attention that Ashurbanipal could not immediately provide while establishing his grip on power closer to home. He would deal with Egypt soon enough. But first, he needed to ensure that the center held, that Nineveh's authority was unquestioned, that the machinery of empire functioned smoothly, that no rival emerged to challenge what the oaths and rituals had established. The young king, who had spent his life preparing for this moment, now discovered that preparation was merely the beginning. The real test of his reign lay ahead. Egypt refused to stay conquered. Taharqa, the Nubian pharaoh whom Esarhaddon had driven from Memphis, struck back almost immediately after news of the old king's death reached the Nile. He swept north from his refuge in Upper Egypt, reclaiming cities that had submitted to Assyria, rallying local rulers who preferred a distant African king to nearby Mesopotamian overlords. By 667 BC, much of what Esarhaddon had won lay outside Assyrian control. Ashurbanipal responded not by marching south himself, but by dispatching his armies under trusted generals. This would become the pattern of his reign, the scholar king who waged war through correspondence and commanders rather than personal presence on the battlefield. He received reports in Nineveh, issued orders, adjusted strategy based on intelligence flowing back from the front. The empire's military machinery ground forward while its master remained at the center of his web. The campaign succeeded. Assyrian forces drove Taharqa back into Upper Egypt, where he died in 664 BC, his dream of restoration unfulfilled. But his successor, Tantamaini, attempted the same gambit, surging north to reclaim the delta. This time, Ashurbanipal's generals pushed further than any Assyrian army had gone before. In 663 BC, they reached Thebes, the ancient capital of the pharaohs, repository of treasures accumulated over millennia, a city whose very name evoked the grandeur of Egyptian civilization. They sacked it. The plunder was staggering: gold, silver, precious stones, fine linen, obelisks, and statues hauled away to grace Assyrian palaces. The destruction resonated throughout the ancient world. The Hebrew prophet Nahum, writing decades later, would use Thebes as a warning to Nineveh itself. Are you better than Thebes, that sat by the Nile with water around her? The city that had seemed eternal had fallen to Assyrian might. No place was safe from the empire's reach, yet Egypt remained ungovernable. The distance was simply too great, the logistics too demanding, the local population too resistant to permanent occupation. Within a decade, Assyrian control had effectively evaporated, replaced by a native dynasty that paid nominal respect to Nineveh while pursuing independent policies. Ashurbanipal had won the campaign and lost the province, a pattern that revealed the limits of even the greatest military power when stretched beyond sustainable boundaries. Closer to home, other frontiers demanded attention. Elam, the ancient kingdom east of Babylon in what is now southwestern Iran, had been a rival of Mesopotamian powers for over 2,000 years. Its kings sheltered rebels, raided border regions, and refused to accept Assyrian supremacy. A series of campaigns through the 600s and 60s BC kept pressure on Elam without achieving decisive victory. The mountainous terrain favored defenders, and Elamite kings proved adept at playing for time, submitting when Assyrian armies approached and reasserting independence when they withdrew. These wars unfolded at a distance from the king who ordered them. Ashurbanipal spent most of his reign in Nineveh, governing from the palace complex his grandfather had built, and he himself was expanding. His days followed rhythms shaped by ritual and administration. Morning brought consultations with priests who examined the entrails of sacrificed animals, searching for omens that would guide the day's decisions. Audiences followed, governors reporting from the provinces, ambassadors from foreign powers, petitioners seeking royal justice. Scribes recorded everything, feeding the archives that Ashurbanipal valued more than any treasure. He commissioned art that presented an image of kingship, both traditional and distinctive. The stone reliefs that lined his palace walls depicted the expected scenes of military triumph. Enemies fleeing, cities burning, prisoners paraded before the throne. But they also showed something rarer. The king engaged in the ritual lion hunt, loosing arrows from his chariot at beasts released from cages for the purpose, dispatching wounded lions with spear and sword in carefully choreographed displays of royal courage. These images were propaganda, but they were also something more. The lion hunt was an ancient royal prerogative, a symbolic demonstration that the king could master the most dangerous forces of the wild. By depicting himself in these scenes with unprecedented detail and artistry, the muscles of the dying lions rendered with almost loving precision, the king's face calm amid the chaos, Ashurbanipal proclaimed himself guardian of cosmic order, the barrier between civilization and the chaos that perpetually threatened to overwhelm it. The reliefs also showed banquet scenes of startling intimacy. Ashurbanipal reclining on a couch in his garden, drinking wine while his queen sat nearby on a throne. Musicians playing softly, servants attending, and in one famous image, the severed head of a defeated Elamite king hanging from a tree in the background. Civilization and brutality, refinement, and violence existed side by side without apparent tension. This was Assyrian kingship, as Ashurbanipal understood it: cultured, literate, devoted to the gods, and absolutely merciless to those who defied imperial authority. While Ashurbanipal cultivated this image in Nineveh, his brother Shamash Shumukin grew restless in Babylon. The arrangement that had seemed workable in 669 BC felt increasingly intolerable to a man who wore a crown but could not act as a true king. Every significant decision required deference to Nineveh. Every assertion of independence risked confrontation with a brother who commanded the empire's armies. Babylonian priests and nobles whispered that their king was merely a puppet, that the great city deserved better than subordination to Assyrian upstarts. Shamash Shumukin listened to these whispers and began to believe them. The brothers' correspondence grew strained. Disputes over protocol, tribute, and spheres of influence multiplied. Ashurbanipal detected hints of disloyalty in reports from his agents in Babylon, suggestions that Shamash Shumukin was reaching out to Assyria's enemies, testing whether a coalition might succeed where individual resistance had failed. The trust that had never been strong between them, how could it be, when one brother ruled and the other served, eroded toward open hostility? By the early 650s BC, war between them had become not a question of whether, but when. In 652 BC, Shamash Shumukin made his choice. The revolt he launched was not a desperate gamble, but a carefully constructed alliance. For years, he had been reaching out to every enemy of Assyria, weaving a coalition that stretched from the marshes of southern Babylon to the mountains of Elam, from the deserts where Arab tribes roamed to the courts of distant kingdoms that chafed under Assyrian demands. When he finally raised the standard of rebellion, he did so with allies who believed, with reason, that together they might bring down the empire. Elam committed troops and treasure, seeing an opportunity to humble the power that had humiliated them for generations. Arab chieftains sent warriors hardened by desert warfare. Phoenician cities on the Mediterranean coast saw a chance to escape Assyrian taxation. Even Egyptian pharaohs, happy to encourage any distraction that kept Assyrian armies away from the Nile, offered support. The coalition represented nearly every resentment the empire had accumulated through decades of conquest and exploitation. At its center stood Babylon, ancient, proud, and determined to reclaim the independence it had lost. Ashurbanipal received the news of his brother's betrayal with cold fury. Whatever bonds of blood had once connected them dissolved in the face of treason that threatened everything their father had built. The succession treaty of 672 BC, the oath sworn before the gods, the careful arrangements meant to prevent exactly this catastrophe. All of it had failed. Shamash Shumukin had chosen war, and Ashurbanipal would give him war. But the king, who governed through correspondence and commanders, faced a challenge unlike any frontier campaign. This was civil war, fought in the heartland of Mesopotamian civilization against a brother who held one of the most formidable cities in the world. Babylon's walls had repelled invaders for centuries. Its population was loyal to their own king, not to the distant overlord in Nineveh. Simply overwhelming the city with military force would be difficult, costly, and potentially destructive to a prize Ashurbanipal intended to keep. He chose siege. Assyrian armies sealed Babylon off from the outside world, cutting the supply lines that fed a city too large to sustain itself from internal resources. The coalition allies were defeated piecemeal, Elamite forces beaten back, Arab contingents scattered into the desert, peripheral supporters abandoning the cause as Assyrian military superiority became apparent. one by one, the partners Shamash, Shum, Ukin had assembled fell away, leaving Babylon to face Assyrian might alone. Inside the walls, the situation deteriorated from desperate to catastrophic. The siege lasted approximately 4 years, and the suffering it inflicted became legendary. Food supplies dwindled, then vanished. Prices for basic necessities soared beyond anything ordinary people could pay. Contemporary accounts, admittedly from Assyrian sources eager to emphasize the horror, described parents eating their own children, citizens fighting in the streets over scraps, the dead left unburied because the living lacked strength to dispose of them. Disease followed famine, sweeping through a population weakened by hunger and despair. Ashurbanipal's own inscriptions recorded the catastrophe with grim satisfaction. I made the people of Babylon eat the flesh of their sons and daughters because of the famine. Their dismembered bodies I fed to dogs, pigs, vultures, eagles, the birds of heaven, and the fish of the deep. Whether the details were literal truth or propaganda designed to terrify future rebels, the message was unmistakable. This was the price of defying Assyrian authority. This was what awaited anyone who broke their sacred oaths. In 648 BC, Babylon fell. How Shamash Shumukin died remains uncertain, but the most persistent account claimed he chose his own end. As Assyrian forces finally breached the defenses, as the city that had resisted for 4 years collapsed around him, the rebel king reportedly set fire to his own palace and perished in the flames, rather than face his brother's judgment. Whether this was suicide, accident, or a story invented to provide narrative closure, Ashurbanipal never saw his brother alive again. The aftermath was brutal, even by Assyrian standards. Ashurbanipal's troops swept through Babylon, hunting down those who had supported the rebellion. Nobles who had encouraged Shamash Shumukin were executed. Officials who had administered the rebel government were impaled or flayed. The common people, already decimated by famine and disease, faced the additional horrors of a sack that spared few who fell into Assyrian hands. Yet Ashurbanipal did not destroy Babylon. He could have. Other Assyrian kings had razed rebellious cities to the ground, sown their fields with salt, erased their names from memory. Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal's own grandfather, had destroyed Babylon in 689 BC after an earlier revolt, an act of devastation that haunted Assyrian legitimacy for years afterward. Esarhaddon had spent enormous resources rebuilding what his father had demolished, trying to erase the sacrilege of destroying the gods' favored city. Ashurbanipal understood that some things could not be undone. Babylon was not merely a political center, but a sacred space, home to Marduk's great temple, repository of traditions that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. Destroying it again would alienate every priest, scholar, and worshipper across Mesopotamia. It would confirm what Assyria's enemies always claimed, that the northerners were barbarians, fit only to destroy what they could not create. So he spared the city while punishing its defenders. He restored the temples, reinstated the rituals, appointed governors who would ensure Babylonian submission without Babylonian kingship. The dual arrangement his father had designed was dead, but Babylon itself would live, chastened, subordinate, stripped of any pretense to equality with Nineveh. The civil war had lasted 6 years and consumed resources that might have expanded the empire's frontiers or strengthened its defenses. It had forced Ashurbanipal to kill, directly or indirectly, tens of thousands of his own subjects. It had ended with a brother's death and a city's devastation. And it had changed the king who emerged from it. The Ashurbanipal of the later inscriptions was harder than the young ruler who had taken the throne in 669 BC. The scholar remained the lover of knowledge and texts, but something had calcified around him. He had learned what it cost to hold power, what sacrifices the gods demanded of those who would rule the world's greatest empire. He had watched a city starve, ordered executions by the thousands, and seen his own brother choose flames over surrender. Whatever innocence or mercy had once tempered his rule was gone. Assyria stood supreme, its last significant internal challenger destroyed. But the empire that emerged from the civil war was exhausted in ways that would not become apparent for years. Its treasury drained, its armies depleted, its subject peoples nursing hatreds that no amount of terror could fully suppress. For now, though, Ashurbanipal stood victorious, and he turned his attention to the project that would outlast his empire, his dynasty, and the very civilization he ruled. The king who had starved Babylon into submission now devoted himself to collecting tablets. It was not a new interest. Ashurbanipal had loved texts since childhood, and he had been gathering documents throughout his reign. But after the civil war, the effort intensified into something unprecedented. A systematic campaign to assemble the entire intellectual heritage of Mesopotamian civilization within the walls of his palace at Nineveh. He sent agents across his empire with instructions that blurred the line between request and demand. Letters went out to temple administrators, to the heads of scribal schools, to anyone known to possess valuable documents. Seek out and send to me any rare tablets that are known to you and do not exist in Assyria. The language was polite. The implication was not. When the king of Assyria expressed interest in your library, you did not refuse. Tablets flowed into Nineveh by the thousands. From Babylon came mathematical treatises and astronomical observations accumulated over centuries of watching the stars. From ancient temple archives came ritual texts explaining how to placate angry gods, how to purify sacred spaces, how to interpret the omens that revealed divine will. From private collections came literary works, medical manuals, lexical lists that preserved the dying Sumerian language, and documents so old their origins had been forgotten. Ashurbanipal did not merely hoard these texts, he had them copied. Armies of scribes worked in the palace, producing fresh versions of crumbling originals, standardizing formats, organizing the growing collection into something that could actually be used. Each copy bore a colophon, a notation identifying the source, the scribe, and the royal patron who had commanded the work. Many bore Ashurbanipal's personal stamp: Palace of Ashurbanipal, King of the world, King of Assyria, who trusts in the gods Ashur and Ninlil. I wrote on tablets the wisdom of Nabu, the signs of writing, as many as have been devised, and I checked and collated them. I placed them in my palace for my royal contemplation. The claim was not empty boasting. Ashurbanipal could actually read what his scribes produced, could check their work against originals, could appreciate the contents in ways no other king had matched. His library was not decoration or status symbol, but a working collection, assembled by someone who understood and valued what it contained. Among the treasures he gathered was the Epic of Gilgamesh. This ancient poem, the oldest great work of literature known to humanity, had circulated in various forms for over 1,000 years before Ashurbanipal's scribes produced what became its standard version. It told the story of a legendary king who sought immortality, failed, and learned to accept human limitations. The flood narrative it contained, a story of divine punishment, a righteous survivor, a boat carrying life through catastrophe, would echo through later traditions in ways its Babylonian authors never imagined. Ashurbanipal's library preserved this text when the originals crumbled to dust. Without his obsessive collecting, without the copies his scribes produced, the Epic of Gilgamesh might have vanished entirely, lost along with countless other works that no one thought to preserve. The Enuma Elish arrived as well, the Babylonian creation epic that explained how Marduk defeated the chaos monster Tiamat and shaped the universe from her corpse. Astronomical texts mapped the movements of planets and predicted eclipses with remarkable accuracy. Medical treatises catalogued diseases and their treatments, mixing practical observation with magical incantation in ways that revealed how ancient physicians understood their craft. Omen literature filled tablet after tablet, recording what it meant when a sheep's liver showed certain markings, when birds flew in particular patterns, when earthquakes struck or rivers flooded unexpectedly. The collection grew to perhaps 30,000 tablets, though estimates vary and the original extent can never be known with certainty. Ashurbanipal organized them in his North Palace, creating rooms devoted to different subjects, developing cataloging systems that allowed scribes to locate specific texts within the vast accumulation. It was the ancient world's greatest library, surpassing anything that had existed before and rivaling collections that would not be assembled again until Alexandria centuries later. Why did he do it? The practical benefits were obvious. A king who controlled information controlled power, and Ashurbanipal's library gave him access to knowledge that could guide decisions, legitimate authority, and overawe rivals who lacked comparable resources. The Omen literature alone was politically valuable. A king who could interpret divine signs held an advantage over those who depended on priests for such wisdom. But practicality alone cannot explain the scale and intensity of the effort. Something deeper drove Ashurbanipal's obsession with preservation. He had seen what empires were, how quickly they rose and fell, how thoroughly conquered peoples could be erased from memory, how even the greatest cities could become ruins haunted by jackals and owls. His own grandfather had destroyed Babylon. His father had rebuilt it. He himself had nearly destroyed it again. The Assyrian Empire might seem eternal from within its palaces, but Ashurbanipal was too educated, too steeped in history, to believe that any human creation lasted forever. Knowledge, though, knowledge might endure where kingdoms crumbled. The texts Ashurbanipal gathered had already survived the fall of civilizations far older than Assyria. The wisdom of ancient Sumer persisted in tablets copied and recopied across millennia, outlasting the cities where it had first been inscribed. If Ashurbanipal could assemble and preserve this inheritance, something of value might survive whatever catastrophes the future held. He was building a monument not to his military victories or his wealth, but to civilization itself. The scholar king who had learned to read before he learned to kill understood that this, not conquered territories, not plundered treasure, not the severed heads of enemies, was the achievement that truly mattered. In his own words, I, Ashurbanipal, learned the wisdom of Nabu, acquired understanding of all the scribal arts, as many as there are. I penetrated the secret of the sky. I have read intricate tablets inscribed with obscure Sumerian and Akkadian, difficult to interpret. I have examined inscriptions on stone from before the flood. Whether he knew it or not, he was preparing his own immortality. Before the quiet years came one final spasm of violence. Elam had supported Shamash-Shamukin's rebellion, and Ashurbanipal did not forget. Through the years following Babylon's fall, he mounted campaign after campaign against the ancient kingdom, exploiting its internal divisions, backing rival claimants to its throne, grinding down its resistance with the relentless pressure that Assyrian military power could sustain indefinitely. In 646 BC, he delivered the killing blow. Assyrian armies swept into Susa, the Elamite capital that had flourished for over 2,000 years. What followed was not merely conquest, but annihilation. Ashurbanipal's soldiers systematically dismantled the city, tearing down temples, smashing monuments, desecrating the tombs of ancient kings. The statues of Elamite gods were hauled away to Nineveh as trophies, divine captives demonstrating that even the heavenly powers of enemy nations could not resist Assyrian might. The bones of Elamite royalty were dug up and scattered, denying the dead the rest they had been promised for eternity. Ashurbanipal recorded the destruction with evident satisfaction. Susa, the great holy city, the dwelling of their gods, the seat of their mysteries, I conquered. I entered its palaces, I opened their treasuries. The tombs of their ancient and recent kings, I destroyed, I devastated, I exposed to the sun. Their bones I carried off to Assyria. I laid restlessness upon their shades. I deprived them of food offerings and libations of water. It was cultural extermination, an attempt to erase Elam not just as a political entity, but as a civilization with a past worth remembering. The kingdom that had rivaled Mesopotamian powers since the dawn of history effectively ceased to exist. Its peoples scattered, its cities ruined, its gods humiliated. Elam vanished into the silence that Assyria imposed on those who defied it. Arab tribes who had joined the rebellion met similar fates. Ashurbanipal's armies pursued them into the desert, burning camps, capturing livestock, dragging chieftains back to Nineveh for public punishment. The reliefs in his palace depicted Arab prisoners forced to grind the bones of their own dead kings, a humiliation designed to demonstrate that not even the trackless wastes could shelter Assyria's enemies. By the mid-640s BC, Ashurbanipal had crushed every significant threat to his empire. Babylon was subdued, Elam destroyed, rebellious vassals punished with memorable severity. No enemy remained capable of challenging Assyrian supremacy. The empire stretched unbroken from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the mountains of Anatolia to the Arabian desert. Yet something had changed. The inscriptions that had chronicled Ashurbanipal's reign in such detail began to thin. After the destruction of Elam, the historical record grows strangely quiet. Fewer royal texts appear. The boastful accounts of victories and building projects that earlier years had produced in abundance dwindle to scattered fragments. It is as if the king, who had documented everything, withdrew from the practice of self-commemoration that had defined Assyrian royalty for centuries. What filled those silent years? The sources offer only glimpses. Ashurbanipal seems to have retreated into the rituals and scholarly pursuits that had always sustained him. The library continued to grow. Omens were consulted with increasing frequency, as if the king sought reassurance from the gods that his victories had secured lasting peace. The palace at Nineveh hummed with the quiet work of scribes rather than the bustle of military preparation. But the empire he had fought so hard to preserve was showing cracks that no amount of ritual could repair. The treasury was exhausted. Decades of warfare, the civil war against Babylon, the campaigns against Elam, the endless suppression of rebellions, had drained resources faster than tribute and plunder could replenish them. The armies that had conquered half the known world were depleted, their veterans aging, their replacements harder to find, as subject populations grew restive under Assyrian demands for manpower. Distant provinces stirred with discontent. Egypt had long since slipped from effective Assyrian control. Babylon, though subdued, nursed hatred that mere submission could not erase. The Medes, Mountain peoples to the east, who had once been divided and weak, were coalescing under ambitious leaders who saw opportunity in Assyrian exhaustion. Even within the court, factions maneuvered for position, anticipating a succession that grew more uncertain with each passing year. Ashurbanipal's sons existed, the sources mention them, but their roles and relationships remain frustratingly unclear. No succession treaty bound the empire's nobles to a designated heir as Esarhaddon's treaty had bound them to Ashurbanipal. Whether this reflected the king's confidence, his indecision, or simply the gaps in our sources, the result was the same. When Ashurbanipal died, no clear path to succession existed. The end came around 627 BC, though even this date is uncertain. No dramatic death scene survives, no account of final words or deathbed arrangements. The king, who had documented his reign so thoroughly in its early decades, passed from the world in obscurity. Perhaps he died of illness, perhaps of simple old age. He would have been nearly 60, an impressive span for an era when far younger men routinely succumbed to disease and violence. He was buried, presumably, with the honors befitting the greatest king Assyria had produced. The location of his tomb has never been found. Whatever treasures accompanied him to the afterlife, whatever inscriptions marked his final resting place, all of it has vanished into the same silence that swallowed the last years of his reign. What he left behind was an empire that appeared invincible and was already dying. The collapse, when it came, was shockingly swift. Within 15 years of Ashurbanipal's death, the empire that had dominated the ancient Near East for 3 centuries ceased to exist. The armies that had sacked Thebes and destroyed Susa, that had made kings tremble from Egypt to Iran, melted away before enemies who had spent generations waiting for exactly this moment. The succession Ashurbanipal had failed to secure devolved into civil war almost immediately. His sons, Ashur-etililani and Sin-shar-ishkun, fought each other for the throne while the empire burned around them. Generals declared independence, provinces broke away, and the subject peoples who had endured Assyrian brutality for so long sensed that the hour of vengeance had finally arrived. The Medes struck from the east. Under their king Cyaxares, these mountain warriors had transformed from scattered tribes into a unified military power capable of challenging Assyrian supremacy. They found eager allies in the Babylonians, who had never forgiven the horrors of the siege, the famine, the years of humiliation under Assyrian dominion. A new Babylonian dynasty under Nabopolassar joined the coalition, adding the resources of Mesopotamia's richest region to the assault on their former masters. One by one, the great Assyrian cities fell. Ashur, the ancient religious capital that had given the empire its name and its patron god, was captured in 614 BC. The conquerors showed no more mercy than Assyria had shown its own victims. Temples were plundered, palaces burned, populations scattered or slaughtered. 2 years later, the Allies turned their attention to Nineveh itself. The siege of the city Ashurbanipal had adorned with his palace and his library, lasted 3 months during the summer of 612 BC. Unusually heavy rains swelled the rivers, and ancient accounts suggest that flooding damaged the walls, opening breaches that the defenders could not repair. When the end came, it came completely. The Medes and Babylonians poured through the broken defenses, and Nineveh, the largest city in the world, the seat of an empire that had seemed eternal, died in fire and blood. Sin-shar-ishkun, the last king to rule from Nineveh, perished in the destruction. Like his uncle Shamash-shumukin before him, he reportedly chose flames over capture, dying in his burning palace rather than facing the vengeance of enemies his family had wronged for generations. A remnant of the Assyrian army retreated westward, propped up a final king at Haran, and held out for a few more years with Egyptian support. By 609 BC, even this shadow of empire had been extinguished. Assyria was gone. The destruction was so thorough that within a few generations, the location of Nineveh itself was forgotten. The palaces that Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal had built with such pride, the carved reliefs, the towering walls, the gardens and temples, all of it collapsed into mounds of rubble that whined and rained, gradually buried beneath layers of earth. Shepherds grazed their flocks over the unmarked graves of kings who had once terrified the world. Later ages remembered Assyria only as a byword for cruelty and pride brought low. The Hebrew prophets had thundered against Nineveh, and their predictions of doom seemed vindicated by history. Greek writers transformed the last Assyrian kings into a figure called Sardanapalus, a decadent weakling who spent his days in luxury while his empire crumbled, finally immolating himself in his palace when enemies breached the walls. The image bore little resemblance to Ashurbanipal, but accuracy mattered less than the moral. Pride goes before destruction, and the mighty will be humbled. For over 2,000 years, Ashurbanipal existed only as this distorted shadow, a cautionary tale about imperial hubris, his scholarly achievements forgotten, his library buried beneath the sands of Iraq. Then the excavators came. In the 1840s and 1850s, British archaeologists began probing the mysterious mounds near the city of Mosul. Austin Henry Layard tunneled into what proved to be the ruins of Nineveh, uncovering palace walls still lined with carved reliefs that depicted scenes of royal hunts, military victories, and ceremonial splendor. The ancient kings emerged from oblivion, their stone images blinking in sunlight for the first time in 25 centuries. Layard found more than art. In the ruins of Ashurbanipal's North Palace, his workers uncovered room after room filled with broken clay tablets, thousands of them, tens of thousands, the shattered remains of the great library. The documents had been baked hard by the fires that destroyed Nineveh, preserving them through millennia that would have reduced unbaked clay to dust. Looters and weather had scattered and damaged countless pieces, but enough remained to transform humanity's understanding of the ancient world. The tablets travelled to the British Museum, where scholars began the painstaking work of reading languages that had been dead for 2,000 years. In 1872, a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith was cataloguing fragments when he realized what he held in his hands. A Babylonian account of a great flood, complete with a righteous man building a boat, gathering animals, and surviving divine punishment that destroyed the rest of humanity. Smith was so overwhelmed that, according to witnesses, he set down the tablet, began removing his clothes in agitation, and declared that he was the first man to read that after 2,000 years of oblivion. The story made international headlines. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in Ashurbanipal's library, had returned to human knowledge, carrying with it implications for biblical scholarship and ancient history that scholars are still working through today. Tablet after tablet yielded its secrets. The creation myths, the astronomical observations, the medical texts, the omen literature, the royal correspondence, all of it emerged from the fragments Ashurbanipal had gathered, copied, and catalogued. The scholar king, who had boasted of reading inscriptions from before the flood, had preserved those inscriptions for a future he could never have imagined. The empire he ruled survived barely 15 years after his death. The dynasty he belonged to vanished entirely, leaving no descendants who could claim his legacy. The cities he adorned became nameless mounds, and his own tomb has never been found. But the library endured. Today, over 30,000 tablets and fragments from Ashurbanipal's collection reside in museums around the world, forming the single most important source for understanding ancient Mesopotamian civilization. Scholars read his colophons, study the texts he gathered, and reconstruct the intellectual world of a culture that flourished and vanished millennia before the modern age. Every student who encounters the Epic of Gilgamesh, every researcher who studies Babylonian astronomy or Assyrian history, owes an unacknowledged debt to the king who understood that knowledge was worth preserving. Ashurbanipal was not a kind man. He starved cities, flayed prisoners, desecrated the tombs of ancient kings, and waged wars of extermination against peoples whose only crime was resistance to Assyrian domination. The same hands that held the stylus ordered atrocities that still disturb readers of his inscriptions. He embodied the contradictions of his civilization, cultured and brutal, scholarly and savage, capable of profound appreciation for human achievement and utter indifference to human suffering. Yet something in him reached beyond the violence that defined his age. In an era when kings measured greatness in conquered territories and slaughtered enemies, Ashurbanipal measured it also in tablets gathered, texts preserved, knowledge rescued from oblivion. He understood, perhaps alone among the rulers of his time, that empires fall, that armies scatter, that even the mightiest kings become dust, but that words inscribed in clay might outlast them all. He was right. The palace walls crumbled, the empire collapsed, the dynasty ended. But in the ruins of Nineveh, buried beneath centuries of silence, the library of Ashurbanipal waited, patient, enduring, immortal. The last great Assyrian king, the first true scholar king, and in the end, the only one whose achievement still matters. The end.